That very first bullet, complex text, that phrase you're going to see over and over and over and over again. You're going to hear it over and over and over again. Very important. Another piece that is really important in that one has to do with being self-directed learners. And many of our students currently are not self-directed. They're not independent. So that is something that's a whole process beginning in kindergarten to become more and more independent and self-directed in their learning. That second bullet, strong content knowledge. Works of quality and substance. There is definitely a trend happening away from heavy reliance on textbooks. The works of quality and substance has to do with authentic documents. What would an authentic document be? Give it a guess?
More primary source type of material.
Very good. More primary source material. So, for example, instead of learning about the Civil War from a social studies textbook, you might begin that whole process with the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address would be your textbook to start the discussion about the Civil War. All right? In Appendix B, there are primary source documents, even for music and art, okay, for teachers to engage with. The next bullet, being able to adjust your work, you know, depending on who your audience is going to be, being able to adjust your purpose, all right, depending on what the task is. Was definitely embedded in the old core. The top of the right-hand side talks about comprehending and critiquing, but look at the end there. Being able to question the author or speaker's assumptions, assess the veracity of claims and the soundness of the reasoning. All right? You will encounter students, and you probably were one of these yourself, I know I was, that whatever I heard on TV, I thought was true, okay? On the internet, students doing research. Many of them, if it's on the internet, then it's true. It's a good thing, all right? So being able to step back and say, this doesn't really make sense. Why? All right, to really question the author. Valuing evidence, that word being able to cite specific evidence. In the new core, beginning in 3rd grade, doing research, students will be expected to begin properly citing material, beginning in 3rd grade. The next bullet, we know technology is here, digital media is here. This particular one has to do with using it smarter, more efficiently. As you go out into the schools, depending on what level you are, if you're helping students do any kind of a research project, they go online, they're looking just randomly, Googling tons of stuff. Takes them a long time to weed through all that. This standard really has to do with, okay, this is my task. What technology will get me my answers quicker and more efficiently, all right? Knowing what your options are out there and being able to save tons of time because you know what tools are out there, you know what tools will get you, get your tasks completed in the quickest amount of time. And then the last piece, in the old core, there definitely was room for multiculturalism and diversity, but this one actually has must learn and work together. So not only are you going to develop an understanding of divergent cultures, but that other piece of learning and working together is in there. And then toward the end, you'll see great classic and contemporary works of literature. There definitely is a trend back to incorporating the classics. Anyone know what we mean by the classics of literature? That's the oldies but goodies. All right, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. Many of those types of books were taken off reading list because of the content, because of the language. Now the trend is students need to understand the language. It reflects the time period, what was acceptable at that time period. Also going back to Shakespeare, and now at the secondary level, Shakespeare is again required. It's not recommended, it's required. All right, going back to the classics. So this is an overview of what, as students leave 12th grade, this is like a perfect picture of what they should possess. All right? Comments? Questions? All right. So as we go through here, there's 3 phrases that are going to be interwoven from this point on. Academic vocabulary, close reading, and evidence from text. Instructional shifts. These are the 6 shifts. In your folder, you do have a page that has the instructional shifts for ELA and literacy. Blue? Yes, in blue. So the next few minutes we'll be going through a few of these shifts. So there's 6 of them. And these 6 shifts are going to be embedded in the new New York State assessments. The first 2 shifts, balancing informational and literary text and building knowledge in the disciplines, on the new assessments, they will have more nonfiction pieces, and there will be authentic pieces of text. The next, the staircase of complexity, will have higher level of passages with more difficult reading levels. In fact, we have been promised, for example, on the 3rd grade, at the end of 3rd grade, when students take their ELA assessment, the passages will be at grade level, 3rd grade, but there also will be passages written on the 4th and 5th grade level. So the expectation is by the end of a grade span, that student should be reading to the top end of that grade span and higher. Number 4 and 5, text-based answers and writing from sources. There will be definitely a trend where students will have to focus on answers by going back into the text itself. They will be forced to reread parts of it over and over in order to get the correct answers. And then the last is academic vocabulary. And academic vocabulary is a type of vocabulary that students should be able to figure out even though they don't have access to a dictionary. All right, so I'm going to show you some techniques a little bit later on how that can be done. These PARCC assessments, once again, the PARCC assessments are going to replace the New York State assessments. PARCC is actually a consortium. I think there's 26 to 28 states that are part of this PARC consortium. All these states will be receiving the same assessments. They'll be given at the same time across all 26 to 28 states. That's why right now the intent is our New York State regents eventually will go away and they will be replaced by the PARC assessments. So it won't matter if you are in Georgia or Alabama or New York or New Hampshire or Alabama, South Carolina. Teachers all have the same common core to go by. All of the students will be taking the exact same test. So that in itself is quite a challenge. Now, all of you are familiar with this critical lens essay. All of you took the New York State Regents in English Language Arts in order to graduate from high school. The critical lens was always a quote, and you were expected to pick out 2 pieces of literature from your, 3 years in high school that you could discuss that quote with, and also you had to embed literary elements in your essay. You might look upon this as fondly or not so fondly. This is an example, and all we have are little snippets of examples from PARC, what the new assessments might look like. So this is an example of what would be in place. The assessment would provide some kind of extended text about Richard Wright. And then after students have read this, you would get the task. And look at the sophistication of the language in that task. Struggles to find his place in society, refuses to forego his morality and beliefs to conform to the status quo, examine Wright's pride, find examples in the text that demonstrate the influence pride on his actions. How does it influence decision? Is it positive or negative? How does Wright's pride affect how his family members treat him? Now, they gave us a sample of what an annotated piece would look like. This is just one piece of it. I'll give you a minute just to kind of skim through. Once again, note the sophistication of the language. All right, so within that, you can see ideas that when you were taking the ELA Regents, that your teachers encouraged you to, you need to include some specific details. You do need to go back into the text. And here on the right is an annotation about the complex ideas, how they're organized, all right, how it creates a cohesive piece. Transition and syntax are important. And developing the topic thoroughly, using relevant facts, extended definitions, details, quotations. Notice we have a citation there. So on these PARC assessments, once again, students will be expected to embed that. Now, the piece that goes with that is the essays as an example. In order to get what is considered to be a superior rating on an essay like this is equated to a 750-word essay. Okay, so I was very curious what 750 actually looked like. If I could word process and double space, it would be this much. All right, and then going on to most of a third page, double spaced. If I had to sit down and write it out by hand, it would be just one-sided. it would cover this page, and this page, and this page, and then 3/4 of another page. Wow. Now once you see, I mean, once I saw that, I mean, I taught for 34 years, and I want to say most of my students never wrote 750-word essays. In the new Common Core, in Appendix C, the exemplars for kindergarten show students writing 1-paragraph pieces by the end of kindergarten. However, in the actual core for kindergarten for writing, there is no standard that says students must be writing 1-paragraph compositions. It's not there, but it is in the exemplars for kindergarten. The exemplars for grade 3 show the equivalent of 3-paragraph essays. However, in the Common Core itself, it does not say that by the end of 3rd grade, students will be writing 3-paragraph essays. But you stop and think, why did they even put these in the exemplars if they're not actually required in the standard itself? Well, I think this is the reason. This is the reason. Students need to be approaching writing 3-paragraph essays at a much younger age if they're ever going to be able to write these kinds of essays on the new Park assessments. All right? So the writing piece of the new standards is really a very, very key piece. It can no longer be ignored or pushed off. Really, in kindergarten, it does need to begin there. As students developmentally are able to handle it, begin to write those types of compositions, even to build the stamina for writing. All right, most high school students, I would bet, given a task like this, they would view this, well, this is like a mini research paper. All right, and when you think they're going to sit down at an exam and be expected to kind of filter through all this information to come up with a coherent exam, it's pretty daunting. All right, once again, that rigor is definitely at a more difficult level. Now, notice that for ELA and literacy, it didn't talk about math at all. Math has its separate standards, but I want to give you an example of how the reading and the writing piece is all through math. This is the old 5th grade math test, what it looks like. All right, so you have basically, it's a fraction kind of thing. The new sample is this. All right, so you look at this. It's also on fractions. Eating 1/4 of a piece of cheese pizza, all right, and then 3/8 of a pepperoni pizza, and then a mushroom pizza, all the way down. And then it says, who is correct? You know, you have the 2 different individuals. Who is correct? Show all of your mathematical thinking. The new Park assessments will have mostly word problems, looking like that. So, reading and writing, once again, is going to be key, even in math, in the new assessments. And in the new core, you definitely, word problems, the amount of them that need to be done has definitely been increased. By 3rd grade, in the new core in math, by 3rd grade, students are expected to have all their computational skills down pretty pat. All right, their multiplication, you know, division, all that. And then after that, we get into these more complex pieces with word problems. All right? Oops, got ahead of myself. Okay, So in your packet in the blue, this is where we're going to begin looking at each shift. There are 6 shifts for ELA in literacy. Shift 1 has to do with increasing the amount of informational text that students have access to in pre-K through 5. It is 50-50, all right? So 50% of what is done at the elementary level should be the literary text. 50% should be informational text. And this is really quite a shift because currently across the country, most of what students are exposed to at this level would be literary text. Notice science and social studies, arts and literature through text. Another statistic across the United States in pre-K through 5, only about 7% of science and social studies is actually taught through authentic pieces of text. The trend over the past 10-15 years is actually embedding these things in their basal reading series or their literature series, where these science and social studies are taught as part of their reading class. There's definitely a trend toward, even in kindergarten, actually having a set amount of time for science, a set amount of time for social, set amount of time for health, and so on. So that definitely will be a challenge within schools with the amount of time focused on reading skills to begin to put science and social studies, as people in those fields would say, in their rightful place in the curriculum. All right? And that is also why in the Common Core you have that set standards for literature. You have those set standards for information text, directly related to Shift 1. Shift 2. The word domain is in Shift 2. And for grades 6 through 12, it has to do with more in-depth work in a discipline. It has to do with teaching less content, but more in-depth with a topic. The ideal for shift number 2 is if you are in biology class, as the year progresses, as a student, you actually begin to think like a biologist. You know what questions are key to biologists in the field doing research. You can understand how to read biology, and you can understand and have the ability to write as a biologist writes. All right? So it's really getting into the mind of the expert in the field, whether it's a biologist, a chemist, a mathematician, historian, all right? Whatever it might be, to really have the opportunity to go in more depth. And the top countries of the world that rank up there for literacy and math, which the United States hasn't done so well in those rankings, and there's many reasons for that. But one of the key common strands throughout all of those countries are they have a nationwide curriculum, but they don't teach everything in the curriculum. They have picked out key units to do, and they go in depth with those key units. And when they come to take these nationwide or international tests, even though they have not been directly taught everything in the curriculum, their teachers haven't covered the curriculum, they do well because they have acquired the problem solving, the critical thinking to apply what they've learned in these key units to other areas. And this is a much different way of thinking for us in New York State, because in the field, when those state tests come along, if a teacher hasn't covered something that might be on the test, like the month before, there's like this crash. Yeah, you can relate to that. I see the head shaking up and down. This crash course, you know, I know we haven't covered this, you know, time ran short, but you really need to know this for the exam. So this is going to be a real shift, if you will, in how teachers think, even in teacher prep institutions such as this one. When you're preparing, what do I really need to focus in on? And you're going to be in on the ground floor for all of this. You will be in the trenches as you, hopefully you'll be gainfully employed, or even if you're subbing for a while, you'll have the opportunity to see teachers not only struggling with this, but also really looking at it in a different viewpoint. What can we let go of? What do we absolutely need to keep? So that will be important. The next one, this staircase of complexity.